castles looked impregnable, but the enemy often sat inside. Massive stone walls, tall towers, and deep moats created the illusion of absolute safety, a bastion of civilization in the midst of a wild and dangerous world. People believed that behind these stones they were protected from any external threat. But history proved time and time again that this was not the case. The most impregnable fortresses fell not to battering rams, but to invisible enemies lurking in the very heart of the castle. Hunger, disease, and betrayal destroyed defenses more effectively than any army. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why the most reliable bolt on the gate was useless when the main enemy was already feasting at the Lord's table, and how ordinary water became more deadly than boiling oil. Betrayal was the most effective and cheapest way to take any fortress. Why spend months on a siege and lose thousands of soldiers when you can simply find one person willing to open the gates? A disgruntled knight, an ambitious captain of the guard, or just a servant promised a bag of gold? Anyone could be the key to victory. The history of sieges shows that most fortresses fell not because of the power of battering rams or catapults, but because of human weakness. Finding such a person was an art in itself. Spies infiltrated castles disguised as merchants, monks, or refugees, listening carefully to conversations and looking for discontented people. They played on human weaknesses, greed, envy, revenge, or wounded pride. An experienced scout could, in a matter of days, get a complete picture of the relationships within the castle and find the weakest link. The commanders of the besieging armies hired entire networks of agents who were active long before the siege itself began. These people lived in the area for months, making acquaintances and gaining trust. They studied the characters of key people in the castle, their habits, fears, and desires. When the army finally approached the walls, the spies already knew exactly who to approach with an offer. History is full of examples of great castles falling because of one person. Often the traitor was someone from the Lord's inner circle, someone who was trusted the most. It was a stab in the back from which the defense could not recover. When the gates opened or the drawbridge was lowered at the most unexpected moment, the defenders simply did not have time to react. One of the most famous cases occurred during the Crusades, when a powerful fortress in the Holy Land fell in one night. The captain of the guard, offended by being passed over for a higher position, let the besiegers in through a secret passage. By morning, the castle was completely captured and the garrison was slaughtered in their sleep. No catapults or siege towers could have achieved such a result so quickly. Betrayal poisoned the very atmosphere inside the castle. Suspicion and fear became constant companions of the besieged. Everyone began to see the enemy in their neighbor, and this destroyed the unity that was so necessary for survival. People were afraid to speak openly, fearing that their words would be misinterpreted. Sometimes gold was not even needed to open the gates. Blackmail was no less effective a weapon. Threats to the traitor's family, who remained outside the castle walls, often worked without fail. The besiegers could capture the knight's wife and children in a neighboring village and present him with a terrible choice. There were cases when bound hostages were brought to the castle gates and threatened with death if a certain person did not open the gates. Not everyone could bear to watch their loved ones being tortured. Many broke down and betrayed their comrades, realizing that they were dooming all the other defenders to death. Complex feudal relationships often led to betrayal. A vassal might be dissatisfied with his suzerain and, at the decisive moment, simply switch sides to the enemy along with his troops. This created an instant breach in the defense. The feudal system was built on personal oaths and obligations, but these ties were fragile. If a lord insulted his vassal, took away his lands, or failed to keep his promises, the resentment could last for years. And when the right moment came, old scores would resurface. A knight could decide that his oath was no longer valid if his suzerain himself had violated the terms of the agreement. Such betrayal was considered particularly dangerous because the vassal knew all the weak points of the defense.
The king will hear of this. We must hold the line.
Even the most loyal defenders could break under pressure. Long sieges, hunger, and despair forced people to look for any way out. The promise to spare their lives and property in exchange for surrendering the castle sounded too tempting to many. When supplies ran out in the castle, disease set in, and hope for help faded, even brave warriors lost the will to resist. The besiegers skillfully exploited this psychology. They could deliberately prolong the siege without taking decisive action, simply waiting for hunger and fear to do their work. Sometimes leaflets were thrown into the castle, promising amnesty for those who surrendered first. These promises were rarely kept,
What if it's a trap?
but desperate people clung to any hope.
Try, don't we? There is no other way.
I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think is a stronger motivation for betrayal, greed, or fear? Write about it in the comments. The main protagonist of any siege was the artillery of the time. Huge catapults and trebuchets methodically hurled stone blocks weighing hundreds of kilograms at the castle walls day after day. Their goal was not to break through the wall immediately, but to shake it, create cracks, and ultimately bring down an entire section. To protect the attackers, engineers built mobile shelters called mantlets or cats. Under their cover, sappers approached the base of the wall. Their task was to dig a tunnel, reinforce it with wooden supports, and then set them on fire, causing the wall above the void to collapse. If the walls were too strong, siege towers were used. These huge wooden structures, often taller than the castle walls, were slowly rolled up to the fortifications. From their tops, archers could fire at the defenders, and an assault squad could storm the wall via a drawbridge. The battering ram was another classic assault tool. A huge log with a metal tip suspended on chains inside a covered pavilion was swung by dozens of soldiers. Its monotonous blows were directed at the most vulnerable part of the castle, the gate. The defenders, in turn, did not sit idly by. They threw stones and logs at the siege engines and poured boiling resin and water on them. Special teams with long poles tried to push the ladders and siege towers away from the walls. But the defenders' main weapon was archers. Occupying advantageous positions on the walls and in the loopholes, they could shower the attackers with a rain of arrows. Crossbowmen were especially valued, as their bolts could pierce armor at a great distance. Despite all its power, a direct assault often ended in failure and huge losses for the attackers. The defenders were in a more advantageous position, sheltered behind thick walls. Therefore, an assault was only resorted to when other methods failed. Even if the assault was successful, it was only the beginning. The fighting continued in the narrow streets inside the castle, in every house, on every staircase. Capturing the walls did not mean final victory. The noise and fury of an open assault was only one, the most visible side of the threat. But what if I told you that the most dangerous enemy had been inside the walls from the first day of the siege and could not be struck by an arrow? In the next chapter, you will learn about a silent killer who mowed down the castle's defenders more effectively than any sword. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about is that castles were ideal incubators for disease. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of people, the garrison, servants, residents of nearby villages, were confined to a tiny patch of land. At the same time, the sanitation system in a medieval castle was, to put it mildly, rudimentary. All human waste and food scraps were simply thrown into the courtyard or the moat. In such cramped conditions, this quickly turned the castle grounds into a foul-smelling dump. This filth became an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. Water sources were the main vulnerability. The well in the courtyard was the main source of drinking water, but it was constantly exposed to contamination. Waste from the surface easily seeped into it, poisoning the water and causing outbreaks of intestinal diseases. The besiegers were well aware of this weakness and actively exploited it. One of the most effective techniques of psychological and bacteriological warfare was to throw decaying remains into the castle. This not only poisoned the air, but also served as a source of infection. Food stored for the siege was also a source of danger. In damp and poorly ventilated cellars, grain and flour quickly became moldy. Eating spoiled food led to mass poisoning. The crowded conditions contributed to the rapid spread of any infection. A common cough or runny nose in a confined space could quickly turn into an epidemic. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The lack of basic hygiene made the situation worse. People rarely washed, and their clothes were infested with parasites. This created ideal conditions for the spread of diseases such as typhus. The castle's defenders were trapped. They were protected from the enemy's swords, but completely defenseless against microscopic enemies. Disease decimated the garrison from within, weakening it and undermining its morale. Sometimes an epidemic was the deciding factor that forced a castle to surrender. When most of the garrison was sick and unable to hold weapons, further resistance became pointless. The castle fell, unable to withstand the invisible siege.
There is no point in fighting.
The gates were always the most obvious weak spot. They tried to protect them as best they could. They built massive gate towers, equipped them with portcullis and drawbridges. However, it was the gates that most often became the main target for battering rams. Even the thickest oak doors, reinforced with iron, could not withstand the blows of a heavy log indefinitely. The problem was that gates were, by definition, a movable part of the structure. They could not be made as massive and monolithic as walls. Hinges and locks, no matter how strong they were, remained vulnerable points. In addition, the wooden gate leaves could be set on fire, which made them an even weaker link in the defense. Some castles had double or even triple gates with a long corridor between them. This was called a barbican and significantly strengthened the defenses. However, the construction of such a structure required enormous resources and time. Many castles, especially small border fortresses, could not afford this and had to settle for simple gates with a single grate. The corners of castle walls were another problem. Right angles were vulnerable to tunneling and created blind spots that were difficult to shoot from the walls. That is why later towers were made round, which allowed for more effective sector fire. A right angle created a blind spot directly at the base of the wall, where defenders could not see the enemy. An enemy who reached such a corner could work there undisturbed, digging a tunnel or installing supports for battering rams. Defenders had to lean far out over the parapet to see what was happening below, risking being hit by arrows. Round towers solved this problem by allowing all approaches to the wall to be fired upon without any blind spots. Two large loopholes designed for shooting bows and crossbows could themselves become a threat. An experienced enemy archer could hit a defender through such an opening. Therefore, over time, loopholes became narrower and more complex in shape. Early medieval loopholes were simple, vertical slits, quite wide on the inside. This gave the defender a good view and convenience when shooting, but made him vulnerable. An enemy arrow or crossbow bolt could pass through the loophole and hit the archer. There were cases when experienced enemy crossbowmen specifically hunted defenders, appearing in loopholes. One well-aimed shot could kill a commander or an experienced warrior, which seriously weakened the defense. Later, loopholes began to be made in the shape of a cross or with an extension only inside the wall. On the outside, there remained a narrow slit through which it was almost impossible to hit, and from the inside, the defender had a sufficient angle of view and fire. This design required more complex stonework, but significantly increased safety. Secret passages and gates designed for sorties or escape were a risky element. If the enemy learned of their existence, they turned from an advantage into a deadly trap. An assault squad could use them to sneak inside unnoticed. Secret passages were usually made in the most unexpected places, at the base of towers or under the cover of natural folds in the terrain. The problem was that such a passage did not remain absolutely secret for long. Servants, workers, and builders knew of its existence. It was enough for one person to talk or be bribed, and the secret ceased to be a secret. The enemy could set up an ambush at the exit of such a passage, or even worse, enter the castle through it. There were cases when the defenders themselves became victims of their own secret passages. A group of warriors would leave through a secret gate for a night sortie, and the enemy, already aware of it, would lie in wait. The warriors would not return, and the enemy would obtain information about the location of the entrance. Sometimes the besiegers would simply observe the area around the castle and notice traces leading from an inconspicuous door in the wall. The location of the well was also of great importance. If the well was close to the wall, the enemy could try to poison it by throwing something over the wall or even destroy it with catapults. It was safest to have several sources of water. A well located in the center of the inner courtyard was protected from direct attack, but such a location was not always possible. Water was found where underground sources allowed, and this was not always a convenient location. Some castles did not have their own wells at all and depended on cisterns that collected rainwater. This made them extremely vulnerable during a long siege. Poisoning the well was a common tactic. The besiegers threw animal carcasses, sewage, or specially prepared poisons into the water. Even if the defenders fished these items out, the water could already be contaminated. Diseases caused by contaminated water killed the garrison faster than the swords of their enemies. Therefore, ideally, a castle should have had several independent water sources, but this was a rare luxury. Even the height of the walls was not always a guarantee of safety. Walls that were too high required more resources to build and were more vulnerable to siege artillery. A reasonable balance between height and thickness was required. A tall but thin wall could be breached by stones from a trebuchet or destroyed by a tunnel faster than a lower but massive one. Wooden elements of the structure, such as tower roofs or internal buildings, posed a serious fire hazard. The besiegers actively used flaming arrows to start fires inside the castle. Fire in a confined space could cause more damage than a direct assault. Stone walls did not burn, but everything else was a fire hazard. The roofs of towers and internal buildings were covered with wooden tiles or straw. This was cheap and practical, but extremely dangerous. A single flaming arrow hitting a dry roof could cause a serious fire. Inside the castle, there were usually wooden structures, stables, warehouses, and residential buildings. All of them could catch fire from the slightest spark. Sometimes the miscalculations were related to the landscape itself. If there was a hill or rock near the castle that was higher than the walls, the enemy could place siege engines there. This gave them a huge tactical advantage. Shooting downwards is always easier and more effective than shooting upwards. Stones launched from high ground flew farther and struck harder. A trebuchet or catapult set up on a hill could destroy the castle walls while remaining out of range of return fire. The defenders had to either endure constant bombardment or make a sortie to destroy the enemy machines, which was extremely risky.
Get it ready. Move, move.
Thus, each castle represented a complex compromise between defensive capabilities, construction costs, and terrain features. There was no such thing as a perfect fortress. An experienced commander could always find a weak spot in the design, even at the drawing stage. The history of sieges shows that even the most powerful strongholds fell when the attacker found their vulnerability. Building a castle was an incredibly expensive undertaking, affordable only to kings and the wealthiest feudal lords. It required enormous amounts of materials, stone, wood, iron, and the labor of thousands of skilled workers. Construction often took decades, but even after construction was completed, the expenses did not stop. Stone walls and wooden structures required constant repair. Rain, wind, and frost slowly but surely destroyed stone and wood, and without timely intervention, the fortress could fall into disrepair. The largest expense was maintaining the garrison. Soldiers had to be paid, provided with food, clothing, and weapons. The larger the castle, the larger the garrison required to defend it, and the higher the costs. Food supplies were a separate headache. The castle needed huge reserves of grain, meat, wine, and other products to feed all its inhabitants. These reserves had to be constantly replenished by purchasing them from peasants or collecting them in the form of taxes. The castle was the center of administration for the surrounding lands. This required a staff of officials, scribes, and servants, who also had to be paid. Administrative expenses were an integral part of castle life. In peacetime, the feudal lord's income from his lands covered these expenses. But in the event of war or crop failure, the financial situation could deteriorate sharply. The lord could go into debt to maintain his fortress and army. If the feudal lord went bankrupt, he could no longer maintain the castle in proper condition. The walls began to crumble, the garrison scattered due to lack of pay, and the granaries emptied. The castle lost its combat capability. Sometimes financial difficulties forced the lord to take extreme measures. He could lease his castle or even sell it to a wealthier neighbor. Economics often dictated terms that were more important than military strategy. Thus, financial stability was as important an element of defense as high walls. A castle that was too expensive to maintain became a liability rather than an asset. It was a silent, invisible threat that could destroy the fortress from within. Man learned to build walls to protect himself from other men, but he was powerless against the forces of nature. Weather and natural disasters were a constant threat to any castle. They could cause damage comparable to the effects of a long siege. Heavy rains and floods posed a serious danger. Water could wash away the foundations of the walls, especially if the castle stood on the banks of a river or on weak ground. This could lead to the partial collapse of the fortifications, creating a dangerous breach. Winter was a harsh test for the castle's inhabitants. Severe frosts made life in the cold stone rooms unbearable. Water in wells and moats froze, and snow drifts could block roads, cutting the castle off from the outside world. Lightning strikes were another threat, especially to tall towers. Lightning could not only damage the masonry, but also cause a fire if it struck a wooden roof. Extinguishing a fire at a great height was an extremely difficult task. Drought also caused problems. Wells and streams dried up, depriving the castle of its main source of water. This made it vulnerable to siege and increased the risk of fires, which could be sparked by any spark. Strong winds could tear off roof tiles and damage wooden structures. Hurricanes, although rare, could cause serious damage to the castle. Nature constantly tested the strength of human creations. Earthquakes, even those that were not very strong, were devastating for stone buildings. They could cause cracks in the walls, weakening them and making them vulnerable to siege weapons. In seismically active regions, this was a constant threat. Landslides were a danger to castles built on hillsides or cliffs. Heavy rains could cause soil displacement, which could damage or even destroy part of the wall. All these natural phenomena required constant attention and repair costs. The lord of the castle had to wage an endless struggle, not only against enemies, but also against the elements. Nature was a relentless enemy that could not be defeated. This constant struggle with the elements served as a reminder that even the most powerful fortress was only a tiny island of stability in a chaotic world. And this island was always in danger of being swallowed up by the elements. For centuries, castles dominated the battlefields of Europe. They were symbols of power and virtually impregnable strongholds. But at the end of the Middle Ages, an invention appeared that changed the rules of the game forever and ended the era of stone fortresses. That invention was gunpowder and artillery. The first cannons were primitive, inaccurate, and dangerous to the artillerymen themselves. However, they had one quality that no siege engine before them had. They fired directly with tremendous force. Cannonballs fired from a trebuchet caused only superficial damage to walls. A heavy cast-iron cannonball fired from a cannon pierced through stone masonry. Several such hits in one spot could quickly make a huge breach in the wall. The high stone walls, which had been the main advantage of classical castles, suddenly became their main weakness. They were an ideal, large, and immovable target for artillery. The higher the wall, the easier it was to destroy. Military engineers tried to adapt to the new reality. They began to build lower and thicker walls that could better absorb the energy of a cannonball. Earthen ramparts and bastions appeared, which were more difficult to destroy. But this was a completely different architecture. The era of majestic, soaring, knightly castles was coming to an end. They were replaced by squat, angular forts designed for artillery duels. Cannons also changed the tactics of siege warfare. Now it was no longer necessary to spend months on blockades and starvation tactics. A powerful artillery battery could reduce a castle that had been considered impregnable for centuries to ruins in a matter of days. Centralized monarchies which had sufficient resources to create powerful siege artillery gained a decisive advantage over rebellious feudal lords. The king could now easily destroy the castle of any of his vassals, which contributed to the strengthening of royal power. The advent of gunpowder was not just a technological revolution, but the end of an entire era. The castle ceased to be a reliable refuge and center of military power. It became a picturesque but militarily useless anachronism. Thus ended the centuries-long arms race between castle builders and those who sought to destroy them. Chemistry had the last word. The roar of cannons became a funeral march for the medieval castle, which had finally lost its reputation as a safe place. The history of these stone giants is not only a story of battles and heroism, it is also a reminder of human weaknesses, engineering miscalculations, and how new technologies can turn the whole world upside down overnight. The castle fell not only under the blows of cannonballs, but also under the weight of its own problems. Today, castles attract us with their romantic aura, but we must not forget that they were harsh and dangerous places. They were not so much a safe home as an eternal battlefield where the enemy could appear from any side, including from within.
No one here.